Thank you, everyone, and to the American Bar Association, to Pratibha Jain, and to everybody here. This has been a G20 weekend because from the foreign ministers meeting to the finance ministers meeting to Raisina, where among everything else I spoke about G20 yet again, but had a fabulous panel to do so. If you look around, it's really tempting to believe that the G20, or this grouping of the 20 of the world's most consequential countries, can be the new global problem solver. The reason we believe that, or we hope for that, is a terrible indictment on the current multilateral system that exists. But just so that we don't get carried away, I just want to remind you of one thing, that in the last 2 years, G20 leaders, foreign ministers, etc., have not been able to stand together for a family photograph because they can't bear to be with each other. So just to give you a note of realism there. At the core of this should be an acknowledgement from all of us, and I think the Prime Minister laid that out in the beginning of his remarks to the G20 foreign ministers last weekend, that we must acknowledge that multilateralism is in a crisis today. Is in a crisis. And your colleague, the Mexican foreign minister, said that really eloquently at the Raisina, day before yesterday. There are multiple crises at work, and all of you know that. A pandemic, which was followed by a financial crisis, an East-West divide in the form of a US-China rivalry, a war in the global north that is impacting the global south disproportionately and deepening what we call the north-south divide. So from the age of globalization, we might be moving to the age of the global fracture. The challenge for everybody and for the global leadership that we see today is how do we get global divisions that we can see deepening every day, and how do we put sustainable development at the core of our business, and how do we put sustainable development that is inclusive. The world needs a new global high table, and I think we are all agreed on that. If you look at the UN Security Council, it doesn't work. It has been paralyzed and it remains paralyzed. So it really cannot, it has all the implements, but it cannot work because there is a veto and nobody will accept the other's point of view. The Bretton Woods sisters function in an age that we left far behind. Even the WTO doesn't work anymore because the core of the WTO, which was its dispute settlement mechanism, stopped working because there are no judges there, because America has no longer put judges there. We have to find a new system. But in this and in today's day, the global south remains in focus because this vast swath of countries across Asia, across Africa, even across Latin America, they feel neglected and left out, and no inclusive development, no inclusive economic growth or sustainable goals can be possible if we do not take what the Global South has in perspective. They felt left out during the pandemic because they were the last in line to get vaccines. They felt left out later because the financial crisis that came in afterwards, the global inflation, because they didn't have the luxury of being able to print money or being able to put stimuluses in place. But these created the kind of inflationary trends that impacted them. The Russia-Ukraine war was a triple whammy. I don't think there is anybody in the world which endorses what Russia did in Ukraine. Is that a problem? Oh, okay, sorry. I don't think there's anybody that endorses what Russia did in Ukraine. But if you are a country in the global south, one country invading another is honestly not a novel activity. There are many countries in the global south that have gone through this, at least in the last couple of decades. That happens. What the response to the invasion, which is the sanctions, the bans, the throttling of the global SWIFT system, the fuel, fertilizer, food crisis, the triple Fs that came about as a result of the war, has impacted the global south disproportionately. Last year, I'm a journalist, so I'm a news junkie, but the last year, the Commonwealth Summit, 54 countries united by the English language and the old British Empire in all its facets. The Commonwealth Summit wanted to draft a really tough statement on Ukraine. The country after country in Africa refused to do so. This year, if you look at the Munich Security Conference, it's the first time the global north is actually admitting that there is a problem, that there is a problem in taking along the global south on Europe's view of the Russia war in Ukraine. I think there will be a financial summit later this year by the French. But that's not the point. The point is that today there is a large part of the world that is dealing with almost unsustainable levels of debt. And these countries are small. It's a vicious cycle. These countries are small. Their debt burdens are immense. There is nobody that is looking at alleviating those debt burdens. To add to this is the fact that there is a sowing season coming up in many, many parts of the world. There is a fertilizer crisis. Because there is a fertilizer crisis because of the Ukraine-Russia war. There is a food crisis because the deal that was supposed to have happened on grain from Ukraine isn't actually what it's supposed to be doing. So there isn't that much grain coming out. On energy, yes, an entire continent is Europe is deprived of Russian energy for good reason. They don't want to fuel Russia's war. Russia's going around the rules, going around sanctions. We all know how that is done. India and China are opportunistic buyers. We are buying. But that is not true for a whole lot of other countries who cannot buy. And so there is an energy crisis. There is a food crisis because there is a fertilizer crisis. And all of these are coming up at top speed at the world. In addition, the global power rivalry that we can see happening between the US and China is creating two separate universes, and those universes are not just political and economic, they are technological. And this will have, we don't see it yet. You will see two different versions of AI. You will see two different versions of technological advances going forward. And technology, which is actually the most globalized product, will not be talking to each other. That has its own implications. The green transition, which is something everybody has been working on, at least for the past decade. Although every COP that happens promises a boatload of money for the Global South, it isn't there. The green transition has been severely impacted by the war, not only in the South, but in the North. Germany is restarting its coal mines, its lignite mines. The UK is restarting their coal mines that that had been closed for the last 30, 40 years. For the developing world, the crisis is in manifold ways. For highly developed, indebted countries, and in our own region, we see Sri Lanka, we see Pakistan, we see Bangladesh, all of them in their own versions of crisis because debt, again, is unsustainable. In fact, I don't know if you noticed, but about 2 weeks ago, there was a protest in Paris. No, it's in Berlin, by a group of NGOs that it was on the 27th of February. And they said the protest was that in 1953, the world cancelled Germany's Nazi-era debt as a result of a general agreement, a global agreement, and asking for a similar debt cancellation for the Global South. Now, I bring up all this because if we are to talk about inclusive economic development or even sustainable, or even meeting our sustainable goals, we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we did not look at the world in a more holistic manner. The G20 here becomes very, very important. And this part is actually the big focus area for the Indian G20 presidency. So I'll just quote the Foreign Minister, Jaishankar, who, when he was addressing his colleagues from the other G20 countries just a couple of days ago, he said that for much of the Global South, this is a make or break issue. That the costs of fuel, costs of food, the costs of fertilizer, which means next year's food, all of this, very pressing issues. If you see some of the countries who were struggling with debt, impacted by the pandemic, for them the knock-on effects of this conflict is massive, and it is a matter of very deep concern for India. But we are still not on the same page. If you just look elsewhere at the other part of the world, the French foreign minister and the French president has actually been one of the more, at least has tried to bridge the gap between Russia and the rest. But the French foreign minister was very clear that the Global South maybe having a fuel crisis or a food crisis, but it's because of Russia, and it's not because of the sanctions. That they are two separate actions and have two separate implications for the global south, I think, has escaped many countries. But they are. For many countries on this side of the planet, the war looks very different. And somewhere, I think, we need to acknowledge that. We have to find a way to end this war. For anybody to talk about G20 being an engine for economic growth, it has to first become an engine for geopolitical solutions. We need to pressure our governments and our countries to find a way that A, looks for an end to this war, because this war does not benefit any, it's literally a war of choice. And I think we all have to do our bit to make sure that these concerns stays front and center as we look for ways to get out of our financial crises, ways to get out of our economic crises. If you just sit in this part of the world and you look eastwards and you see China coming out of its zero COVID, the kind of energy sweep that China will do will deprive many in the developed world of energy, because there isn't that much energy being produced. So there isn't that much extra energy being produced. And 3 major oil-producing countries are out of the global market: Russia, Iran, Venezuela. So geopolitical choices will have to be made, and they will have to be made by the G20. How we go forward, of course, depends on André, because he will take over the presidency of G20 by the end of this year. But it is interesting, and I bring this up because for the next 3 years, it's India's turn today, it's Brazil in 24, and South Africa in 25. So which means that G20's leadership literally stays in the global south for the next 3 years. And it is incumbent on, I think, certainly these 3 countries, which actually have a little trilateral of their own, to address the issues that, in a way that we see it, that the South sees it. Because at some point, there is a paralysis in other parts of the world, and maybe we are the ones to be able to break that. On that note, I'll say thank you very much.
I think it's a great pleasure to address this audience. I want to take off from where Mr. Lalit left, I think. He said that it's not important for lawyers just to know law. You need to know the larger environment. So this is going to be a different panel, I think, than the normal panel that you have been inflicted upon, which is on torts and contracts and the future of the legal profession, all of which is terribly important, I think. But I'm trying to make this point that after having an initial conversation with my co-panelists, that we will make this panel about high geopolitics. And I think Indrani, my colleague, has set the tone extremely well. She's making a very interesting point that the G20 should not avoid geopolitics, if I understood you right. And G20 is a little diffident because they keep saying this is not the forum to solve security issues like Ukraine. I thought, I'm now putting words in Indrani's mouth, which is not fair. But if I understood her right, she is making the point that G20 actually cannot avoid these kind of issues. And I think that's a fair point. So that will be the starting point for this panel. I have great pleasure in introducing first Jonathan Blank. In the 5 minutes that I spent with him before the panel meeting, I got to realize that he's an amazing person, 45 years of arbitration practice, That's no mean matter, but he spent a lot of time in India as a peace volunteer. And that attracted me a lot. He's in love with India, and it's a great pleasure to have you, sir, on my panel. So very warm welcome to you. I'd like to introduce my good friend, the Brazilian ambassador to Delhi, André. He's got a name which is really, really fascinating, and he's got the height to match his name. He's also got the profession to match the gravitas of all that. So, André, a very warm welcome to you. And as Indrani said, I think we are going to pass on the baton to Brazil, the G20 baton, that is. And I think it'll be very important that we don't pass on a mess. So that is my first wish for you, André, that I hope we pass on a decent card or hand to you so that you can take it forward. Last but not least, I think we have Ian Johnstone. Very interesting background. He's currently professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, but he spent a lot of time with the UN. And I want to really exploit that, if you like. He's from Canada, and Canada oftentimes gives you this vision of a society which is equitable, which has got the balance right, as opposed to the big neighbor that it has, and so on. So we can also quiz him a little bit about the kind of contribution that G20 can make. So this is all about G20 because you can see also behind my back that we've kind of got permission for the G20 logo. So it's only fair that we talk of G20. I'm going to ask maybe my panelists to give their sense of what they think the G20 can and cannot do. And let that be the starting point before I can deep dive into some of the issues that affect today's geopolitics. So, Jonathan, if I can request you to give us a sense of G20, good, bad, ugly, what are they doing? What is your perspective? What does the United States think of it? Do you think the fact that the UN Security Council is totally paralyzed, does that give an opportunity to the G20 to do something? Or are you a skeptic? So I'm going to request you to start, please.
Thank you. I'd like to start by saying that basically I thought that Dr. Bagchi's speech laid out exactly perfectly much of what I was going to say, and I agree with almost everything she said about the dire state of the world, but I take a more realpolitik view of it, and while I think her speech was basically aspirational, mine is deflationary. I think that the answer to the question, can the G20 provide an impetus to sustainable and equitable development, is no. And the reason is because the Ukraine war, as the sort of the immediate proximate cause, but the geopolitical realities are that we are now in a totally changed world. Over the last several years, we are at the beginning of, or perhaps not even the beginning, of the second Cold War, and that's going to change everything, and it will make multilateralism essentially a thing of the past. The reality is that we have the United States and its allies in the Pacific and in NATO on the one side, and we have China, Russia, Iran, and its fellow travelers such as Venezuela and Syria on the other hand. And this is going to be a long, very expensive struggle, and it's going to determine pretty much everything. And we're in a new Cold War that's going to be very expensive, and it's going to require great resources. And I would say, where are those resources going to come from? How is it going to be paid for? The answer, fortunately, or unfortunately, I suppose it's unfortunately, is going to be sustainability. I think that all you have to do, as Indrani said, all you have to do is look at the reaction of Germany and Europe generally, the preachy Paris Accords and pontificating about the future and pretending that they're going to solve all the future with promises that are never realized has now been unmasked. Germany has given up its suicidal policy of closing its nuclear plants, closing its coal plants, throwing its fate to the good offices of the Russians. It's seen that the Angela Merkel, Gerhard Schroeder idea of the future is a totally disastrous one for Germany and turned on a dime. And the United States, similarly, the United States, we had this Biden-Obama plan of suppressing hydrocarbon production in the United States. Now that has not only been reversed, and the president is lambasting the energy industry for not producing enough, but it's changed, like the Chinese, we've changed history. We said, oh, that was never our policy. Of course it was our policy. They were suppressing hydrocarbon production, but they're now denying they ever did that. Where does that leave the G20? To me, you are all far more knowledgeable on this than I am, but my view is quite simple. The UN has been a total failure. The G20 comes out of the same impetus, which is that if we all just get together and talk it over, we can maintain world peace, and that we have common interests. I don't think that's true. The common interests are now the common interests of the West versus the common interests of the East, that the global South is going to be run over in that process, and basically the victim, I don't deny. But I just think that's the reality, and I think that's who's going to pay for the new Cold War. Finally, just because, as you said, I love India, I'm going to give a comment on India. The post-World War II security architecture of the United States was known as a hub-and-spoke system. We had the United States as the hub, we had the NATO allies and the Pacific allies as the spokes. That formed the wheel. It was the perimeter of the defensive position, basically against Russia and China. The United States has moved from a hub-and-spoke system to a much more network, kind of a digital network, less defensive treaties, although NATO remains very important, but less defensive treaties and more a network. And for example, India's involved in a small organization, well, I'll get to in a small organization called like I2U2, Israel, India, the UAE, and the United States, and it's an informal arrangement. It's a defensive arrangement. It's sort of a network. There are no treaties involved, but it's a technical defensive kind of an operation. Well, the real thing that the United States lusts after is the Quad. The United States likes friends, but it loves allies. And the United States really, really, really wants India as an ally against China. India, since 1947, without deviation through all of its governments, has remained the hard-to-get, the girl that just won't say yes. But the United States is overtly chasing after India as its great love object. And how India plays that over the next few years will have a great deal to do with how the global South lines up. So those are my views. If I can just go totally off topic for just 1 minute, I'd just like to say, because we have so many students here, that I spend a lot of time with Indians. I love India. I love Indians. Indians are very proud, and rightfully so, of the tremendous accomplishments of the people in the Indian diaspora in the United States, and how they've gone to, like the president of Microsoft or the CEO of Microsoft, and the Indians take great pride in the business and political accomplishments. I don't think very many of you know that the leading constitutional scholar in the United States is a PIO. He's Professor Akhil Amar at Yale University. He's, to me, head and shoulders above any other constitutional scholar. He is the most cited scholar by the Supreme Court, and it's something I think Indian law students and lawyers generally should be very proud of.
Thank you, Jonathan. I thought that was a, what would a panel be without a skeptic American calling a spade a spade? It's wonderful. The tagline for me was, America likes its friends, but it loves its allies even more. I will never forget that one-liner from you. Amazing. No, I think you're spot on, really. But I wouldn't dare share your skepticism on G20. We're all chanting the G20 mantra in India for a year, so I'm not going to deviate from the party line on that one. But André, I turn to you now. And I want to tell us all the gory details of what happened at the G20 meeting that you just attended, how much blood on the floor, the body language of Blinken versus Lavrov's outburst. Don't leave out any details. André, over to you.
I love, because he's a very famous diplomat, and he's trying to make me say what he would never say if he was asked. So I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to go a bit in the line of what Indrani was saying, and definitely disagreeing massively with Jonathan, because not because we disagree, because I think that we agree as we agreed outside, but I think that if we look at the world from a point of view of security, then I completely agree with him. It's just that I don't think that we should look at the world from a point of view of security. This is, for most of the population in the world, the agenda is not security. So we have to think of development. The issue is development, and this is a bit, when we're talking about the G20 or when we're talking about the SDGs, this is what I would like to say a few words about. There are agendas, and you as lawyers, you know that better than me. There are agendas that are to restrict some actions. So, by the way, the security agenda is one, and many other agendas are about what you have to avoid. Then you have the agenda of development, which is an agenda of things that you want to achieve. So we cannot compare the two, because if not, we're talking like in two different languages. So my life has been mostly linked to this, what I call positive agenda. And I think that the SDGs are an extremely positive agenda. Why? Because in the 60s, when I was growing up, the United Nations were dealing with development, decolonization, and the 3 Ds, no, development, decolonization, and disarmament. Disarmament is probably the most unsuccessful of all the agendas of the UN, but the other ones were highly successful. And I don't think I need to defend the UN, but I think that every time you look at the UN and you think, oh, they haven't done this, they haven't done this, it's true, because the positive agenda of the UN is very difficult. But what the UN has avoided is extraordinary. If we are preparing to a second Cold War, as Jonathan was mentioning, which I think is a very interesting point, the UN did quite well during the First World War, the First Cold War. We didn't have wars. We did avoid hundreds of abominable situations. So maybe the UN is going to recover in its new context. But I want to come back to the positive agenda. Why are the SDGs a positive agenda? Many of you don't know because you're very young, but the UN in 2000 launched the MDGs. The MDGs were the Millennium Development Goals, which were an idea of the Secretariat of the United Nations, and it was quite interesting. It was to overcome poverty as quickly as possible and try to avoid the worst of extreme poverty in the world. The MDGs were quite successful. But there is another issue, which is sustainability. One thing is overcoming poverty. The other thing is sustainability. There was the first Brazilian environment minister in 1992, used to say, he was a bit special, Mr. Lutzenberger, and he used to say that the world was divided between underdeveloped countries and overdeveloped countries. There was nothing in the middle. And what should be in the middle is a sustainable country. What is the great difference of the SDGs compared to the MDGs? Is that the Sustainable Development Goals apply to everybody because no country, rich or poor, is sustainable. Germany, you were mentioning, the coming back to coal, doing some other many unsustainable things. Japan was completely surprised because the SDGs showed that Japan had very bad marks in 12 of the SDGs. They were perplexed. What do you mean I'm not doing it, you know? So the SDGs are a way of uniting South and North towards something different. We are not aspiring anymore to be like the North, as a developing country like Brazil or a developing country like India. We are aspiring to sustainability, which is something that the North has been extraordinarily incompetent to achieve. So we have to work together. Coming back to the G20 very quickly, I think the G20 has grown because of frustration of other institutions, and Indrani put it very well, I don't need to repeat. So the G20 is somehow, since we don't solve it in the Security Council, since we don't solve it at WTO, we don't solve it at the IMF or the World Bank, let's try to solve it in another structure. So the G20 first provides dialogue, which I think is always good. It's always a positive thing. The other thing is that the G20, by being originally an economic forum and a financial forum, has adopted the agenda of sustainable development, the combat of climate change. Now, climate change is an issue that divides enormously the South and the North in many subjects, but it should not, because of that point that I want to come back to. Everybody is badly behaved regarding combating climate change, the rich and the poor. We both have to make a huge effort. And the way forward in sustainability is an extraordinary opportunity for India. It's an extraordinary opportunity for, let's call it the global South, although we can debate highly this title. But anyway, that's it. I just wanted to bring a point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, André. I still miss the blood and the gore, but the rest of it was very good, substantive. Thank you very much. Great pleasure in requesting Ian Johnstone, and he is, of course, now an academic and illustrious professor, but you did spend a lot of time in the UN, and you belong to Canada. Do you think G20 can, give it its best shot when it comes to, especially, I would say, the problem with the Sustainable Development Goals, as I see it, is that we tend to underemphasize the fact that they are all interrelated. So the SDG 10, which talks of overcoming inequalities between countries and within countries, is intrinsically linked to whether you can do away with poverty or not, whether you can do away with gender disparity or not. So I think that is, one point that we seem to be missing. Each SDG seems to be self-contained. They've got sub-goals and sub-targets, and each country is trying to. I'm very interested in hearing André say that even Japan, a developed country, is falling behind on some SDGs. That is news to me, and it's very interesting. So Ian, from your perspective, from a Canadian perspective, from an academic perspective, where do you think G20 is heading? Do you think this is a good thing that, as Indrani said, we were preceded by Indonesia. We are now taking over we have taken over the mantle. We'll be followed by Brazil and then South Africa. Do you think that's a good thing from your perspective?
Thank you. Thank you, Mohan. And thank you for asking me to join this panel, and thank you to the Jindal School University and Professor Raj Kumar. I'm here for a month. Oh, it's not working. Hello. Hi. I wanted to start by thanking Professor Vice Chancellor Raj Kumar. I'm at the Jindal University for the month of March, and it's a real pleasure to be there. It's a pleasure to be in India. It's been a long time since I was in India, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak to this group, and this is an interesting and lively panel. I've been part of the Raisina dialogue for the last couple of days as well. I have, and as a Canadian perhaps, I have a little more faith in the G20 than at least Jonathan does. I have a little more faith in multilateralism and the future of multilateralism than perhaps others have. But I would start with trying to describe the state of the world. And I think, Indrani, if you don't mind, it talked about, are we heading into an age of global fracture away from globalization? I'm not sure I would put it that way. I would say we are in an age of pluralism, and pluralism in multiple forms, most importantly and most significantly, multipolarity. So I would differ from Jonathan a little bit. I don't think it's guaranteed that we're heading into another Cold War. I think there is a real risk that there will be two sides, two rival sides led by US on one side and China on the other side, and Russia is obviously part of the equation. But I also think it's significant that there's some other significant poles of power, including India, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Egypt, and I don't think any of them are necessarily going to fall into line with one or other of these poles. So I still believe we're in a multipolar world. And I also think another dimension of this pluralism is that there are many different institutional forms. They're the formal intergovernmental organizations like the UN. The UN Security Council is certainly dysfunctional, not quite paralyzed, but certainly dysfunctional. There are other intergovernmental organizations, the Bretton Woods institutions, the WTO, all the specialized agencies of the UN, all of the formal regional organizations and whatnot. And there certainly is a crisis with those institutions. But they're also supplemented by informal groups of states like the G20 and the G7 and the G77 and the BRICS, and many of which India is a part of and influential in and central to. And I think there's reason to be hopeful that the G20 can manage some of this pluralism. It's important to understand what the G20 is and what it is not. The G20 is a group of 20 very influential, powerful states based primarily on their economic status, but also majority of the world's population and political influence resides in the G20, and they have a lot of political clout. But it operates on the basis of consensus. It doesn't have the power to direct. It doesn't have the power to delegate. It doesn't have the power to impose obligations or to collectively impose sanctions. But what it can do is provide political leadership, and it can orchestrate. Orchestration is a little different from collaboration or cooperation. Orchestration is trying to steer and nudge and, to a certain extent, try to manage some of the tensions. And I think that's exactly what the G20 is faced with right now, is trying to manage the tensions associated with this pluralism, and in particular, trying to manage the tensions caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think I agree with others that while it might be nice to be able to say security ought to be left out of the discussions of the G20, geopolitics shouldn't come into it, but that's simply not realistic. Geopolitics are part of this, and managing the geopolitics is something that the G20 has to be able to do. And final point, the Troika, I think, are actually as well placed as any three groups of states to help manage through this period. I'll have a little more to say about what that might mean with respect to the other institutions, including the UN, but maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ian. So what I'm going to do is this will probably be the last round, but Indrani, I will come back to you last so that you also have an opportunity to react. A lot of people have referred to the opening remarks that you made. So I'll begin with you again, Jonathan. I'm a little worried about the role of the state in the United States. And I'm now turning to the role of the state. I do not believe, frankly, that we are any longer in an era of the Washington consensus. The market can do what it wants. I think the pandemic and then now the war, but everything else, climate change, I don't think Goldman Sachs and Citibank is going to solve the problem of climate change or the pandemic. Ultimately, the states had to get involved. vaccines had to be produced in collaboration with governments, even though the private sector was actively involved. So do you like what you're seeing in some countries? And I refer, sorry to put you on the mat, but since you are honest and straightforward, the role of the state in the United States, if one party comes to power or the other, I think I see the role of the state swinging really in the US from one extreme to the other. And do you believe or do you buy my theory or my proposition that the state has an important role to play, whether it is sustainable development, climate change, or any other major issue?
Well, I have two things to respond. One is that with regard to governance, the United States is probably at the bottom of where it's been, at least in the last 100 years, and we're not doing very well with regard to governance. And we are swinging much, the parties are far too far apart, and we're swinging between one pole and another, and that's certainly unhealthy, and it's certainly reflected in the fact that there's no foreign policy consensus anymore. We had a foreign policy consensus for 60 years until 1990, and it's now broken down. On the other hand, I believe that the answers to climate change will not be those that are currently on the table. I believe that the answers to climate change, and there will be answers, will be technological in development. And there the role of the state is huge. I believe that the United States must, I don't know whether it will, but must, and I think there is a chance that we will, engage along with the rest of the world in a massive development of technology along the lines of the Manhattan Project that will not provide interruptible power, which I think is not going to be at all the answer to providing energy in the future, but to sustainable power that we don't even know how it's going to be. And there, certainly the role of the state will be critical.
Thank you, Jonathan. André, the role of the Brazilian state, you've done some remarkable things in reducing the level of poverty in Brazil. I don't know the current state of inequality, but do you think the state has an important role to play in the future?
Yeah, well, I'm a civil servant, so you can imagine I tend to like the state. But the fact is that I believe that the state is extremely important for directioning, including the private sector. But I believe that not the overwhelming state that we have seen, that be it in India or in Brazil, have not allowed some sectors to go ahead, etc. And by the way, I like very much the idea that many of the progresses of our countries, India and Brazil, happened because the civil servants didn't understand the new technologies and allowed it to go ahead just by ignorance and not by any other reason. But I believe that the state has really to fulfill some of the basic elements of the contract between the population and the state. And this contract has been broken in most countries, and I think this is a very, very important debate. It's not the state against people or the state against business. Business has now the answers, and I agree with Jonathan. I love to agree with you, Jonathan, on the answers to climate change. And by the way, the answers we are having today for climate change are already technological. It's thanks to technology that we are being able to have a positive agenda in climate change. But, so, the state has to be reformed. The state has to stop being just thinking about its power. The state as a driver of solutions and a driver of justice, a driver of reduction of inequalities. Yes, in Brazil, I think the state has been extremely successful, although still far from what should be. But in health, for instance, we have a universal coverage that amazingly is the largest of a developing country. We have also support for lower income families. But as a liberal would say, how can you have support to low income families that need to continue more than 25 years? So it means that the other policies are not working, since you still have all these poor people that are needing this support. And there enters an element that I believe that is very, very important for India and Brazil, which is demography. The growth of the population in our countries is something that is often underrated by economic analysis. Both India and Brazil multiplied their population by 4 since 1945. Norway increased 5%. France had half of its population at Napoleon's time. So it's simply impossible to a Norwegian or a French to understand. And one of the magic of the United States is immigration, how you have been able to increase your population and always have young people. And the denial of demography is one of the tragedies of our time. And by the way, the greatest challenge China is going to face now is demography. Russia is in a situation in which demography is absolutely central. We have to remember that Russia's economy now is the size of Spain's economy. So we are living in a very, very complex world, and that's why I come back that we should not concentrate on security. How can a country have the economy of Spain and have the security relevance that it has? These are some of the questions that we have to think on this new alignment in which, obviously, India and Brazil should be the winners. Thank you.
Thank you, André. It's still remarkable that Brazil has gotten rid of extreme poverty. That's amazing. So it leaves only 2 regions, ladies and gentlemen, with massive, massive millions of extreme poverty. One is sub-Saharan Africa. The other is South Asia. I'm being diplomatic when I say South Asia. Actually, it should be India because of the numbers involved. But anyway, Ian, because Canada has a relatively better reputation in North America, perhaps the best in terms of delivery of services, the role of the state in Canada has always been important, and that's why you have a better system of healthcare and so on. Do you think that is going to keep Canada in good stead when it comes to the future, sustainable development, climate change, and so on?
What can I say other than yes? Canada is sometimes described as a kinder, gentler United States, but I'm not sure it's an apt description, and there are a lot of Canadians who feel marginalized and wouldn't necessarily agree with that. But no, I think that the state has been an important factor in the Canadian economy, and especially in social development. So we have a relatively effective healthcare system, which is largely state-run, state-directed. We have a relatively good educational system, although in some ways closer to the U.S. in terms of the disparities in who has access to higher education. But tying this to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I want to come back to something the ambassador said about what's distinctive about the Sustainable Development Goals compared to the MDGs is that they are universal, and they're based on the understanding that every state in the world falls short in some ways. And one of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 16, is about governance. It's peace, justice, and strong institutions, and it's about access to justice and accountable, transparent governance. And there are gaps in states in the global north and in the global south with respect to that goal. Inequality. Equality is one of the goals, and as Mohan has said, obviously that's not a problem only in the global south. Sustainability, environmental protection. So the idea here is that every government, every state has a responsibility to work to fulfill these goals, not necessarily on their own, in partnership with others, but also inevitably suggests there's a significant role for the state. And there is a sort of post-Washington consensus mantra, which is, it's not all about less government, but about better, more effective government. And I think that's embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think that's going to be probably a good way of thinking about how to move forward on achieving them.
Thank you, Ian. If you can pass it on to Indrani. No, in any case, I had a question, Indrani, and then you'll have the last word, so to speak. In terms of India, I think it would be incorrect or misleading if I said the size of the state is the point at issue. That is not. If anything, most would argue that we should shrink. I think the problem in India, and you can react to this, I think it's really the efficiency in terms of delivery. And that seems to be the problem. Nevertheless, we've had a Right to Food Act, which is quite remarkable, if you ask me, because it talks of 75% of the rural population and 50% of the urban population, which will be entitled to food grains. And that is what we have now with 800 million people getting 1 kilo of lentils and 5 kilos of food grains, despite a lot of leakage. But I just wanted you to tell us from an Indian perspective what you want to see as the role of the state for future challenges.
So, so the role of the state has increased enormously. And it has increased partly because the current geopolitical fracture between US and China, a large part of it is attributable to the laissez-faire attitude to market forces. Because you were you wanted a cheap place in China, you moved manufacturing to China. They're a country of very bright people. They reverse engineered, stole technology, took technology, developed technology, just became a technological powerhouse of their own. In fact, I think Aspen, which is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, has a study which came out last week that out of 44 critical and emerging technologies, China leads the US in 37. That is seen in the US as a product of the fact that you allowed everybody to find their cheapest place. If you look at the CHIPS Act or the IRA that came about last year, the language is very, very clear. You cannot sell to the Chinese or move to China in 10 years. It is a subsidy. It is protectionist, definitely. It brings industrial policy back in the mecca of free market. If you think that that has no implications in India, that's not true. We have what did the pandemic teach you? The pandemic taught, at least India, that we may be a pharmaceutical powerhouse, but we had literally absolved ourselves of any responsibility to keep control of our pharmaceutical ingredients. Because at the beginning of 2020, when China literally weaponized its lockdowns, there were no pharmaceutical ingredients to be had. There was a global shortage of paracetamol, which was what we were producing. And how did that happen? It happened because you allowed China to distort its WTO entry and did not hold it to account when it subverted market forces with the kind of subsidies and distorted markets that made it impossible for you to produce at any respectable price, and so your productions moved to China. So as a result, in India, we had a double whammy. We not only had COVID, but we had a Chinese incursion across the line of actual control in eastern Ladakh in early 2020. Just look at our response, and it is a response that's similar to the US. We take a technological response. because what did we do? We weaponized our own, we weaponized our market, but also we weaponized Chinese access to India's tech sectors. In the run-up to the incursions, and I go back to April 2020, China was effectively kept out of India's, of investing in India's tech sectors, particularly its fintech sector, for very, very good reason. You are looking, people only look at the apps that were banned, but the apps, there is a lot that goes behind that. Because China weaponized its civil military fusion first, and led everybody else to weaponize their own markets and states. And therefore, states have obviously now got a very, very big role in industry or in technology.
Thank you. Thank you, Indrani. No time to sum up, but I just wanted to pass on a very fervent request to the many students present here. Take a look at the G20 statement. I know you guys never do, but I think it's worthwhile when 20 important countries in the world get together, they come up with a joint statement, even if it is a chair summary. Start taking a look at it. I think that'll keep you in good stead. Thank you very much to my co-panelists.
But I do have to say that you must remember what Jonathan said. Inject that note of realism, because not everything that's in the statement will be in reality.